There are a lot of things that are tough to talk about when it comes to mental health, but video games shouldn't be one of them. Games have generally gotten a bad rap on mental health. They've often been accused of causing violence and addiction among their players.
Video games are overwhelmingly violent, sexist, and racist.
But focusing on those fears misses the bigger picture. Video games are also able to tackle mental wellness in a variety of ways. This is Next Level, a show about how video games shape the real world. And for this episode, I've dredged up our very own impromptu therapy couch so I can fully unpack the past, present, and future of video games and mental health. We're partnering with the experts of Take This, a nonprofit organization focusing on mental wellness in gaming, to better understand how games impact our psyche, and how we can all forge a healthy relationship with the medium. As art forms go, video games are still a relatively newish medium.
Jerry, video games are the latest craze to sweep the country and most of the world, too.
I could have done that for longer.
It's almost another world here in the video arcades of America.
And every new fad faces a bunch of skepticism and scrutiny.
Psychologists are beginning to worry that some youths are becoming spaced out on the space games.
For games, there was one narrative that formed very early on. Video games were gory, brutal bloodbaths that encouraged kids to commit actual violence.
The mere idea that you would enjoy blowing your opponent's head off is a problem.
Fears about violent games go back as far as arcade game Death Race, which sparked protests due to its extremely pixelated depiction of vehicular manslaughter. Early detractors claimed these games held a unique influence over their players' behavior. One Death Race critic told the New York Times, "The player is no longer just a spectator, he's an actor in the process of violence." So this is what that process of violence started off as 50 years ago. And this is where it's going. You can see how things get worse from here. Each new frontier of virtual blood and digital gore raised louder and louder alarms from concerned parents.
Don't shoot, they're crazy!
The panic reached a high watermark in the 90s, with a pair of congressional hearings about how violent and explicit games might be influencing children.
Instead of enriching a child's mind, these games teach a child to enjoy inflicting torture.
So far, so typical. Every new fad, from the waltz to the Beatles to the selfie, is met with reactionary critics carping about the decline of society. But the moral panic over video games is still growing strong.
The level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts.
Video games still occasionally show up in the discourse after mass shootings.
Ramos reportedly became obsessed with the video game Call of Duty.
It seems like these things have gotten so much worse since video games became so realistic and so violent.
We have a lot of panics about technology, but the one about games seems to really stick, despite the fact that we have an overwhelming amount of evidence that a lot of these concerns aren't grounded in the research.
Rachel Cohort is the research director for Take This. She's very familiar with the claims about video game violence and the actual research behind them.
There are hundreds, if not thousands, of studies looking at the effects of games on these behaviors. And what we find is that there's no evidence to suggest that games lead to violence, an increase in violence. There is some research that has found that games lead to short-term increases in aggression directly following gameplay, and that's usually what makes the headlines and kind of get blasted out there.
So, real quick. Scientifically speaking, aggression and violence are two different things. Aggression covers any behavior meant to cause unwanted harm to another person, while violence covers actual physical harm, often serious injury or death. The gulf between aggression and violence is actually pretty wide. There's a whole mix of social and psychological factors that lead to actual violence, of which aggression is only one part of the puzzle. And aggression stemming specifically from video games doesn't appear to be much of a factor in predicting real violence at all. It can also be tough to know how these studies on aggression actually apply outside of the lab. There's often a pretty big difference between the tools researchers use to measure aggression and how aggression can show up in real-world situations. So the official stance from the American Psychological Association is that games can cause a small increase in aggression, but are not linked to violence. So why does this narrative that games predicate violence still stick around? Part of the issue might be that video games just seem different from other media. You're not swinging the sword around in Game of Thrones or pulling the trigger in Heat, for example. It feels like these violent interactions should have more of an effect, even though actual research hasn't been able to find a link. Video games are hardly the only source of media violence in our culture, but their relative novelty and interactive nature still separate them from other media. The moral panic of the 90s may have cooled off, but there's still something of a cultural stigma around playing games.
If I tell someone I binge watched The Witcher over the last 2 days, they say, awesome, wasn't it great? If I say I spent the same 8 hours playing the Final Fantasy VII Remake, they say, oh, okay. It's equally as valid as a leisure activity. It's just the perception. The perception is more negative.
Virtual violence isn't the only behavioral issue in video games. There are still some questions about how games can influence their players' behavior, specifically whether games can compel people to play them too much. It's time to talk about the A word, addiction. Video games are enticing by nature. I mean, how else are they going to get you to spend 1,000 hours pulling up weeds on a farm? But over the years, games have gotten much better at figuring out how to keep players engaged, enough to prompt concerns that games might be encouraging their own overuse. Unhealthy video game use occurs when players start to put their in-game activities over their real-life priorities, occasionally leading to horrific results. In 2019, the World Health Organization codified this type of abuse as gaming disorder, a subtype of addictive behavior. Now, addiction is a loaded term that's most often associated with drugs and alcohol. But addictive behavior patterns, like compulsive gambling, can result in similar losses of judgment and self-control. According to the WHO, game addiction leads to, quote, increasing priority given to gaming, to the extent that gaming takes precedence over other life interests and daily activities. That description does seem to fit problematic gaming patterns to a T.
When we're highly engaged in something, it can look like we're addicted because we are enjoying it, we're invested. And unfortunately, sometimes that gets conflated with this discussion around addiction.
Kelly Dunlap is a clinical psychologist and the director of community at Take This. She also teaches game design at American University, which gives her a unique perspective on how game mechanics influence player psychology. There's still a lot of debate about whether addiction is the right way to frame dysfunctional gaming. For one thing, the issue hasn't received the same decades of scrutiny that violent games have. There's no clear scientific consensus on whether games can cause addiction. So this is about more than just labels. If you call problematic gaming an addiction, that's going to change how people seek and receive treatment for it. Without a solid research base, the addiction approach might just be missing the point.
Someone who had kleptomania or pyromania, you wouldn't use an addiction model to treat them, even though they're also engaging in compulsive behaviors. What is supported by the research is a approach more in line with something that we would treat with, say, obsessive compulsive disorder, something that is more based in the behavioral and cognitive processes rather than the neurochemical processes.
The addiction model has informed government response to the problem as well. Last year, China passed a slew of new restrictions to curb excessive gaming among minors. These sorts of laws rely on the notion that games are an addictive activity that must be forcibly controlled. But again, we don't have the research to know if that's the best way to tackle the issue. Whether or not you call problematic gaming an addiction, it doesn't manifest in a vacuum. Oftentimes, gaming overuse can just as much be about what you're running from as what you're running to. Video games are just one of many activities that can be used as what are called maladaptive coping mechanisms, a distraction to avoid dealing with underlying stress factors.
They're called maladaptive because they don't address whatever the initial thing is that the person became overwhelmed. Anything can be used as a distraction, a maladaptive coping skill, and video games are the same.
Celeste Sangiorgio is a clinical psychologist and postdoctoral fellow at the Rochester Institute of Technology. She both uses and helps develop digital therapy tools and games to treat patients. Her practice taps into the behavioral elements of games, the idea that participating in gameplay can potentially make therapy more impactful. But like other behaviors, gaming can also be used to shut out things you don't want to engage with.
When something is participatory in that way, it can be especially immersive. So that means that you lose time while you're engaging with it. You're unable to process things that are happening around you.
Bad coping behaviors usually stem from root causes, like depression or anxiety. Without identifying and addressing these root causes, trying to curb game overuse can only go so far towards improving someone's mental state. So there are a lot of different behaviors that can turn into avoidance strategies, even normally healthy ones like exercise. But games are a deliberately designed experience, which means that design can kind of be on the hook for how players engage with their games. Certain design strategies, especially in mobile free-to-play games, hinge on convincing players to invest as much time, energy, and eventually money into the game as possible. Intermittent, randomized rewards like loot boxes or gacha pools are meant to keep players coming back on a regular basis.
Doesn't look good.
I'd have stopped playing Fire Emblem Heroes a long time ago, if not for the promise of unlocking some fresh character JPEGs.
I guess in economic terms, it's called sunk costs. So people keep investing time, they invest their attention, and they feel like there has to be some sort of payoff.
Done well, these sorts of inducements can help extend the lifespan of a good game. Done poorly, and these systems start to seem downright manipulative. Stories of players spending inordinate sums of money on ostensibly free games have raised some ethical questions about this type of game structure.
When we're designing, we really need to think about who we're designing for and keeping the player at the forefront of our mind. What do they need and how can we do right by them, not just what do we want as an industry.
It can be tricky to draw a clean line between well-designed games and manipulative structures. But the issue has become serious enough for regulators around the world to start investigating games with loot box design principles. There's currently no nationwide restriction on loot boxes in the US, but the industry has taken some steps towards self-regulation. Major platform holders like Apple and Google now require these type of games to publish the odds behind their mechanics in order to keep players from overspending. Violence and addiction account for a lot of the mental health discourse around games, and a lot of that discourse is critical of games. But that's not all there is to the hobby. As games have become more prevalent, more and more people are finding ways to use games to actually bolster their mental wellness. If you're struggling with mental health issues, it can be really tough to get help. Even assuming you can reach out to a therapist, talking about your issues in a clinical setting isn't an easy task.
Part of trauma that is really difficult in the clinical space is that we suppress it as humans. Our brains are these wonderful and terrible machines where they hide things from us to protect us.
Sarah Hayes is a clinical contributor for Take This, and is one of the many therapists who've started using games in her practice to connect with patients.
They say that clinically, regardless of your therapeutic approach, rapport is the most important element. If you get along, if it's a good connection, then changes can happen.
On a basic level, a shared interest helps therapists connect with their client. If you can talk to your therapist about your Minecraft server, it's much easier to talk to them about your emotions as well. But video games can also help unpack difficult experiences and traumas within the controlled environment of a game. Observing how different players approach gameplay can give some really valuable insights into what they're struggling with.
When games are designed well, they're engaging and they make us feel like we are in there. So I think that they're great at unlocking trauma, experiencing different things, and also helping us relate to others who have been through it, even if we haven't.
Play therapy, or the notion that a child's play can reveal things about their psyche, has been an established practice for decades. It's not clear yet if video games can have the same effect, but they do share similar principles, namely that games allow patients to share thoughts or feelings they'd have trouble experiencing otherwise. There's still a lot of unexplored territory when it comes to video games and therapy. It's the violence and addiction debates that get most of the attention, after all. But there is one benefit to gaming that's hard to deny: socializing. Games have never been a solitary experience. Even the earliest sports needed multiple players in order to function. Modern games are serving as social activities too, and in doing so, they're providing a vital affordance for their players.
Are you the trader?
No.
Leah.
Money! Money!
The idea of virtual socialization is nothing new. If anything, we've all become a little too familiar with the concept in recent years. But video games provide a unique leverage point when it comes to online interaction, a common activity for people to bond over together.
A lot of the times people would kind of form groups like around church or like some other external factor within their city, within their town. But I think the interesting thing is that a lot of online communities are kind of taking that role.
Victoria Tran is the community manager for Inner Sloth, makers of the popular social deduction game Among Us. The game became a cultural phenomenon during the pandemic as a simple way to virtually hang out with your friends. A game about backstabbing your companions might not seem like the best way to build friendships.
What the hell?
But like other online games, Among Us lets players immerse themselves in a shared experience, with concrete rules and goals to guide their interactions together.
So often people talk about themselves in the first person when they talk about games, right? It's like, I attacked this, or I died in this game. You're actually controlling and being this character. And I think that has a kind of interesting identity attached to it.
These kinds of virtual social dynamics are only becoming more common as video games spread. A Pew survey in 2015 found about 36% of teens reported making one or more new friends online via video games. Online games are heading towards becoming just another tool, like Facebook or Twitter, for forming and maintaining relationships in the digital age. But this type of socialization has a dark side. Especially competitive games frequently engender a serious harassment and toxicity problem.
Why did we have to get 2 women? Yo, I heard there's a woman in this game. That needs to stop.
Exactly.
No,
Say it again.
A 2021 Unity poll found about 3 out of every 4 gamers have witnessed or experienced some form of toxicity while playing a game. In-game social abuse tends to be especially targeted at women and minority players, and can lead to real consequences. Extreme harassment behaviors, like publishing personal info or calling the cops on a person's real address, can be physically dangerous or even lethal.
An officer did open fire and an innocent man was killed.
Ultimately, the onus is on game companies to police their own spaces and encourage a more positive community within their games. Many developers are trying in-game messages, strict bans, and clear community guidelines to help curb bad behavior.
It's one of those things where you have to kind of keep actively searching and finding blind spots and figuring out where or how you can improve this space. Really caring for the long-term health of the community and your employees, I think, is something that we can all think about.
With healthy use and a good environment, video games can be a valuable aid for mental health. But video games aren't just passive tools. They're works of art, sometimes with their own messages about mental health. Video games have a decidedly mixed track record when it comes to depicting mental health. At their best, games can offer a unique and authentic depiction of someone's real issues. Other times, it's all dingy asylums and inhuman inpatients. That pattern tracks with other hot and cold media portrayals of mental health. But gaming's participatory nature gives it a unique edge when it comes to positive depictions. Game storytellers can use the act of play to drive their point home, and players who've invested in the game are more likely to respond to those messages. The ability to interact with the narrative of a game is a powerful tool for forging empathy. Players naturally feel more attached to their characters and setting since they have direct control over parts of the virtual world. It's a potent enough effect that empathy can even be built almost by accident.
You can't help it when you're in someone's mind. You're like, well, let's show what they're going through.
That's Tim Schafer, the studio head of Double Fine Productions and a key architect in several beloved adventure games. One of his most famous projects is 2005's Psychonauts, a cartoony platformer about a young psychic venturing into the dark recesses of various people's minds. Psychonauts is a comedy first and foremost. The game uses its mental setting mostly as fodder for jokes. But the central mechanics of the game, rooting around in people's psyches, led to some surprisingly deep and empathetic depictions of mental issues. So when it came time to develop a sequel, Double Fine wanted to lean into the game's ability to depict mental health struggles.
I think society in general thinks about mental health a lot more than they used to, and there's an actual interest in treating it differently than we have in the past. We need to be very careful about all aspects of that, what we do in there, about consent, about representation and all these things.
Double Fine ended up bringing on consultants from Take This and other groups to double check their characterization of mental health.
Look, Mr. Mood, I'm sure we can work this out. For instance, let's examine the source of yikes!
Psychonauts 2, released in 2021, is a sequel with a much more deliberate and thoughtful depiction of the human mind, while also still being a funny game about jumping around a psychedelic landscape. Psychonauts 2 is far from the only game to tackle mental health. There's a whole slew of smaller scale games that depict specific mental health issues via their gameplay mechanics. Games like Celeste, Spiritfarer, and Sea of Solitude all turn the act of play into a metaphorical exploration of conditions like anxiety, loss, and depression. The zany humor of Psychonauts does kind of stand out a bit from other more self-serious games about addressing mental health. But for Schaefer, the levity of Psychonauts makes it easier to approach these sorts of difficult issues.
Laughter is a way of helping people face things they don't want to face if it's really, intense. Like being able to approach something in a teasing way or something in a joking way, the characters can approach subjects that someone would not willingly be like, I want to talk about this serious issue.
I don't know if you want to come in here.
Accurate mental health portrayals are a tough thing to get right in any media, but game developers face the additional challenge of developing an engaging experience for the players as well. It's a lot of hard work to add real-world issues to conventional game genres.
We're going to make a violent game about a character who experiences psychosis. On paper, it's a hard sell.
Dominic Matthews is the studio head of Ninja Theory, a developer known for frenetic action games. Their most recent major project, 2017's Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, sought to retain that combat-heavy gameplay style while centering the game on a protagonist with psychosis. Development on Hellblade involved extensive interviews with patients and clinicians about the lived experience of psychosis.
Really, everything that we do in Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is in service of that story and in service of that experience, and that's what came first. So really, when you think that way around, you're thinking about what is the experience that we want to give a player, and then the mechanical elements exist to service that.
One big feature inspired by this research was the game's auditory hallucinations.
Use your eyes. Use your eyes. Come closer. She can't focus.
Hellblade uses binaural audio to pepper the player with phantom voice clips from all directions throughout the game, in an effort to give people a sense of what actual voice hearers experience.
I hear you.
Attempts to gamify mental conditions like this can often miss the mark. The various sanity meters of Eternal Darkness and Amnesia make for interesting gameplay effects, but are hardly an accurate portrayal of mental illness. But Matthews says the Hellblade team took special care to get things right, even at the expense of the game's entertainment value. That research paid off once the game was released, and some people struggling with similar issues were able to find themselves in the game.
People who said, Senua is really the only person who understands me, or I've asked family members to play Hellblade so that they can understand my experiences of psychosis better. It made me think that how much work there is to do for society in general to open up and say, hey, the world is a safe place to talk about mental health.
Games are as vulnerable to harmful tropes about mental health as any other medium. But when developers focus on getting things right, video games can give their players new and interesting takes on what mental health can look like. It's easy to get swept up in the fears about the negative mental health impacts of games. But like any other technology or piece of media, games can also be a valuable tool for dealing with mental health issues. We just need to figure out how best to use them.